Intentionally Excellent. And today we're going to be talking about redirecting our environment. Okay, this is the call, redirect your environment. And so as we begin, I want to show you a picture. So we can go to the next slide here. I'm going to show you a picture. This is a picture of the earbuds that Delta Airlines gives out while you are on their planes, right? And so I came across this because Bob and Karen, when they were in town, they came in on Delta, and I saw it on our counter, and I just had this kind of realization, and this thing hit me, that you notice the slogan, notice the tagline, plug in, tune out. And I'm about to dog on that a little bit, but when you think about airlines, it kind of makes sense, right? You've got a screaming baby across the aisle, you got some stranger snoring on your shoulder. It's kind of okay. It makes sense that that would be how they would market their earbuds, of tuning out all these noises and distractions. But what I'd like to convey today is that this slogan, I think, says something about our culture, says something about how our society actually views our environments, the purpose of our spaces. So our societal default is to plug in to whatever pleases us. Plug into whatever we like and to tune out whatever things we don't like, whatever things seem contrary to our interests. And this in turn then affects how we view our spaces. Consider these three examples of spaces that we normally operate in. People in this room, these are probably amongst the top three places that you spend your time. Home, work, and church. So if you think about work is typically a place to further your career, a place to increase your income. And so your kind of goals for that space may be prestige or maybe profit. For your home, it's a place to kind of escape, to retreat from the outside world and to just veg out. And so your goals may be entertainment or escape. And the church also isn't exempt from this. We can sometimes see the church as a place just to get my worship fix or to get some positive vibes. And so your goals might more so be comfort and catharsis. What do you notice about all these ways of thinking about these places? They're all about self. The chief question is, what do I get out of being here? What do I get out of this environment? And so redirecting our environment is ultimately about shifting our focus away from self-serving and shifting it towards self-sacrifice wherever we are. So I have a quick example of this that I think was really great from this last week. On Wednesday, we were at the movie theater celebrating Isaac Agri's birthday. It was a great time. The movie was great, but my favorite part about it was after the movie. So one of the brothers in our group was sharing that he was having a difficult day. It was a day defined by some grief and some loss. And so Isaac actually took the initiative to say, let's huddle up and pray for this brother. And so we all huddled up, and that movie theater became a house of prayer in a moment, right? Isaac, it was his birthday. He had every excuse to say, I only get one of these once a year. This is all about me. This is my time. This is my time to shine. Instead, he turned the focus away from himself and onto that brother, and we spent time in prayer. And really, ultimately, the focus became about God, and that was my favorite part of the night. So my goal today for this lesson is to show you why redirecting your environments is actually a superior way to live. To redirect it to self-sacrifice is superior than having it stay where it naturally is, in the self-serving place. And then to give you some thoughts, give you some tips on how to live this way at work, at home, and at church. So let's look at this first passage here in Acts 2. Very well-known passage to our family of churches. The kind of description of how the early church started, just what their kind of relationships were like with one another. And it says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So we talked a little bit about the context of this passage a few months ago. I won't expect you to remember it, but we're going to revisit some of these things because they're really important. They actually contribute to this lesson. It's right before this kind of description of what the early church was like. Peter had just preached during this big Jewish festival, Shavuot. This is a festival for harvest and about the giving of Torah. And so there would have been hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem during this time. And as he preached, the scriptures tell us that over 3,000 people were added to their number that day. And why this is significant is because the church started out as 120-ish people, about the size of our group. And then in a day grew exponentially, was now over 3,000 people. And so many of those people would have likely returned home, but many of them would have chosen to stay, to uproot their lives. And in that era, that would have been a really significant change compared to what we would experience today, partly because they didn't have the same kind of social programs that we have today. To leave one's job, to leave one's livelihood, they didn't have food stamps, they didn't have low-income housing, they didn't have unemployment, any of these things. What they had was each other. That's all that they could rely on, was one another's generosity. And the early church does a fantastic job of meeting these needs, of redirecting their environments to serve the purposes of other people, to sacrifice. So the passage tells us that they sold their possessions and property, which is really an expression, an extension of their work. The fruits of their labor they were happy to offer for the sake of others. With regard to their homes, it talks about people meeting in house to house, jumping around and fellowshipping with one another, like offering hospitality and accepting people's hospitality. And at church, it talks about them meeting together, devoting themselves to one another, and actually it talks about them doing that daily. They clearly wanted to engage with each other, to serve one another, to meet with one another, and it wasn't about self, it was about someone else. The passage also tells us that redirecting our environments towards self-sacrifice is a superior way to live, and specifically that it says that our redirecting our environments will increase our fulfillment and our fruitfulness. Our fulfillment and fruitfulness. So with regard to the fulfillment, it talks about how they have joyful and sincere hearts. They weren't giving out of obligation or really just out of a sense of duty or shame or fear or any of these drivers that could make people give of themselves in this way. Rather, it was out of this sincerity, this generosity, this joyful spirit that comes from, ultimately, of course, their relationship with God. That's where it starts. That's where you get that fulfillment. But your fulfillment is multiplied when you live into something bigger than yourself. One of the greatest ills on our society today is the idea that there is no truth, there is no meaning, and we end up in this kind of nihilistic sort of worldview where there's no purpose to anything. That's kind of the most scary outlook, for me personally. Maybe not for you, but I think for a lot of people, that level of despair to say, nothing that I do actually means anything. Nothing I do has any purpose whatsoever. And people will try and spin it, say, well, that means then you can create your own meaning. You can create your own purpose. But isn't that just a placebo? Isn't that just kind of, wishful thinking, or it's not anything substantial? And so when they're keying into this thing that's bigger than self, they're getting this fulfillment and then expressing it in this way, they're actually experiencing a depth of life, a kind of enjoyment that comes not from just serving self or trying to further one's interests, to try and have a purpose and meaning that you create, but instead keying into what we were actually made for. And that will produce true, sincere fulfillment. And from that fulfillment, of course, there's fruitfulness, because people want to turn. They want to run to that kind of lifestyle. And so you see in the passage, it says that the Lord was adding to their number daily those who were being saved. Because they see their way of life that isn't producing the results that they want. They're seeing their lives have no meaning, no purpose, or have these contrary meanings and purposes. They're actually damaging their hearts, damaging their souls, damaging them physically, mentally, spiritually, and they turn and they see this kind of community. Of course they'd want to join that community. Of course there would be fruit. So redirecting our spaces, redirecting our environment ultimately produces fulfillment, and it ultimately produces fruit. So we're going to talk a little bit, dive into these spaces, work, home, and church, a little bit more in depth, and talk about how we can kind of embody this same kind of spirit that we see in Acts 2. So regarding our work, redirecting how we view our work. Our culture tells us that the primary goal of our different areas of work is to further our own success, to obtain certain things, to obtain personal gain. In Luke 12, 16 through 21, we see a parable that Jesus says, and he starts here, he says, he told them this story. A rich man had a fertile farm and produced fine crops. He said to himself, what should I do? I don't have room for all my crops. Then he said, I know, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all the wheat from my other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. So this parable tells us that our work, the fruits of our labor, can be directed towards temporary purposes or directed towards eternal purposes. And this passage also points out our mortality. The fact that we are mortal puts a lot of things in perspective, wouldn't you say? And so one of the implications of being mortal is the fact that anything that we produce in this life will be passed on to somebody else. You don't get to keep anything that you come in. You know, you come in just with your body and you leave with your body. That's it. And honestly, you don't even leave with your body, I guess. But you come in naked, you leave naked. What is the saying? There's some sort of saying. I can't remember how it goes. But the thing is, the question is, if the things that we produce in this life will naturally pass along to somebody else, what are you going to pass along? What do you want to pass along? Is your life constructed in such a way where you're passing along the right things? And to be clear, I want to make sure people hear this, because there's kind of this like Christian undercurrent which kind of generally looks at wealth in a really negative light. I don't know if that's your view, but there's definitely this kind of like, we need to be this kind of, or taking a vow of poverty, you might have heard, is kind of something that, some Christians do. But I'm not saying that wealth is bad. In his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, Christian professor and minister Dallas Willard challenges this simplistic view of wealth in which it's demonized or seen as inherently anti-spiritual. And he makes the case that Christians should approach their finances with this mentality of a healthy mixture of stewardship, of generosity, and frugality. And he says, our possessions increase the range within which we can reign in life by Christ Jesus and see spiritual power defeat the deadly reign of sin. Riches are creations we are to use for God. And later in the book, he also mentions how, the status or the position that you may gain can also be used for that effort. It can be either directed towards self, towards temporary goals, or it can be directed for the sake of others, for eternal goals. And so the issue here is less about how much wealth you gain, but about how you use it. And that it's not unspiritual to have prestige, to have position, to have wealth, to have things. But what are you using them for? Because when we look at Acts 2, they didn't use it for self. They took it as an opportunity to pass it along for someone else's sake, for spiritual goals rather than worldly, temporary goals. And that's why we see in Matthew 25:29, which is this kind of a culmination of what many of us know as the parable of the talents, which kind of is a little bit of a misnomer, because when we hear talent, we think of a skill, which isn't not something that you can give back to God, but the actual context is about money. is about bags of gold, about a master leaving away from his home and giving his servants parts of his estate to use for the benefit of his estate. And it says this, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. So this isn't, well, let me just go and do things for God because he's going to give me more, right? That's not the motivation. But the point is that we want to use what God has given us. Use whatever status, use whatever, possessions and resources at our disposal to serve his kingdom, to bless other people. And in that, we will really live into that same kind of mentality we see in Acts 2. Now, redirecting our home. Let's talk about our homes. Our culture tells us that our homes are meant to be our retreat, meant to be our way to kind of tune out the outside world. And we fill our homes with all kinds of creature comforts. And I think it's really telling that historically, homes were built around the hearth or built around the dinner table. Why? Because they're spaces for people to gather and connect. Nowadays, what are houses built around? Netflix, TV. It's built around the TV. The whole house is focused around the entertainment, the places that you escape, that you tune out, like we said, the outside world. So if you're wondering whether or not you have a home with high hedges, whether or not your home is one that is accessible in which you are welcoming others in or where you are tuning others out, here's a good litmus test. Do you know your neighbors? What are their names? What are their concerns? What do they do for a living? Because we can hardly reach the outside world. We could hardly be a light to our communities if we don't know the people who live right next to us. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at this. I'll tell you, there's sometimes I'm taking out the trash and my neighbor comes out and I'm like, hey, Matt, we'll just walk and just kind of mind my own business. I need to get back in. I got to go finish my sermon, right? But the point is, are you connecting with other people around you? Or is your home a place for you to withdraw and retreat from the outside world? God gave us our homes, and he gave us our neighborhoods as an opportunity to demonstrate his heart of hospitality. His whole goal in creating the world is to create a space for us to dwell with him. His whole goal in giving us a hope of heaven is the same thing, giving us the space to dwell in his presence. God is a God of hospitality. And we are built in his image. And we're meant to express that part of his personality. Now, another side to this that we may not often think of is sometimes we're really quick to invite people to church or invite people into our homes. But there's another facet to this about redirecting our homes, redirecting that environment, is actually getting out of our homes, leaving our homes behind and getting into other people's homes. And why is that significant? We actually see this example in Luke 10. At the beginning of Luke 10, Jesus sends out his disciples in pairs, telling them to stay in people's homes, to eat whatever is presented to them, to accept others' hospitality. And the significance of this is that we actually give people home field advantage. We allow ourselves, we show that we care enough to step out of our comfort zones, to step out of the spaces where we feel like we are in control and we know what's going on, and we step into their life, into their world. And part of why that's significant, too, is that that's how you actually know people. You see them in the context of their own spaces, of their own lives. You actually get to know what their actual needs are because you're engaging in their environment. So we need to be willing enough not to just share our homes, not just to share our church, but to leave our home behind and to be where other people are, to meet them where they're at. That's a huge part of hospitality. And so I've seen some examples of this in this room. I know of stories in which people are like moving houses literally to be in a space where they'll be able to offer more hospitality to their neighbors and people that they meet. I know of people who are opening up their homes to welcome people in, to house people who are in difficult situations. And I know of people who are driving far distances to meet with people in places that are convenient for them. This is something that's already happening in this room, but that if we lean more into this, we can experience the power of God's hospitality like we've never seen before. And finally, redirecting our church. Okay, let's talk about this. Our culture tells us that church is primarily about getting my spiritual sustenance. And there's some truth in that, right? Church is to get spiritual sustenance, but it needs some clarification. Let's look at a couple passages here. First, in 1 Corinthians 12:7, and then we'll look at 1 Peter 4:10. 1 Corinthians 12:7 says, "A manifestation of the Spirit is given to each person for the common good." 1 Peter 4:10 says, "Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms." The point here is that church isn't for consuming. Church is for contributing. Church isn't for what I get, what I consume. It's for what can I give. And we've heard this messaging before, but honestly, it's very difficult because we give so much in our day-to-day lives. So many of us have difficult work environments where it requires so much emotional energy and time and resources and all these kinds of things. And so we just want to go to church and get filled up. But this great paradox of how this thing works is when you give, that's how you get filled. Because everyone's doing it for one another. And so of course, I have to lift up all the examples in which we see that in the church. Our worship ministries, our tech, we've got, our hospitality, our first impressions group. We have people setting up decorations. We have people who are small group leaders. Like all these examples of people in this room serving in wonderful ways. That is fantastic. I'm proud to be a part of a church that loves to serve, that loves to pour themselves out, and in that find themselves filled. A trusting that God will take care of them, a trusting that their brothers and sisters will fill them up as they devote themselves to filling others. But if that's not you, if you don't have a space where you're serving, then you can't take advantage of that opportunity. And so that's the question. Is there a space that you can step in and serve, where you can contribute to this family, to this body, this mission that we're doing together? So here's our call to action. There's a few of them, actually. I don't know if it's too small to see, but I'm going to read them for you anyway. And you don't have to do all these things, but if any of these things hit you from what we've talked about today, take one of these things and run with them, because these are practical ways to live into this thing where you can feel, where you can experience what the people in Acts 2 were experiencing. They were experiencing that fulfillment, experiencing fruitfulness that was just happening naturally in their lives. First is reflect on your position, your skills or assets, and focus on how you can use those to broaden your scope of influence for God's kingdom. Find out the ways where you can use what God has given you to bless others, and then go and do it. Don't just reflect. Find out what it is and go and do it. Second is very simple. Meet your neighbors. When you're out walking your dog, when you're taking out the trash, or go knock on someone's door and, bake them cookies or whatever. There are people who are used to that when someone moves into this, town. And if they haven't met you yet, they wouldn't even know the difference. You may have been living by them for 5 years and they don't know who you are. But give them something. Just find a way to engage with your neighbors and know what their life is. Know their name even. And over the next couple of weeks, have someone in your home or visit someone else's home. And I would especially encourage you to do this with someone that's new, with someone that you haven't engaged like this before. Open up your home, step into somebody else's home. And then finally, find a regular way to serve in the church. What are your gifts? What has the Spirit given you personally that you can offer? Because part of the power here is that we're also different. That you have something special, you have something unique to contribute. God didn't put you here for no reason. He put you here to be able to use what he gave you for his purposes. So reflecting back and remembering this slogan from Delta's earbuds. Plug in, tune out. Let's rework that. Instead, let's do tune in and reach out. Tune in to what's happening around you. Gain an awareness of what the actual needs are. And then reach out a helping hand to serve, to support, to love. And remember that, this is all based on what Jesus did for us. Jesus is the ultimate person who tuned in and reached out a hand of support. Jesus redirected his environment in the most crazy way. He gave up heaven. He gave up his home in heaven to come and dwell with us in our environment, to meet us where we were at. He gave up everything, and he didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that should be all the motivation we need to live into this lifestyle of redirecting our environment. And let that thought guide you to tune in, to reach out. Let's pray. God, we have so many opportunities to serve. God, and I've seen so many examples in which people are offering of their lives. They're offering of their possessions, God. They're using their work, the fruits of their labor to bless others, God, and using their homes to invite others in, to not see it as a space for self, a space to ultimately just retreat from the world and focus on us. God, and using this place and being engaged in church in such a way where they're offering their gifts that you've given, God. Help us be inspired to do that all the more. Increase our desire, increase our ability, our awareness of even the things that we can do to grow in this area, God, that we'd be motivated by love, motivated by a deep appreciation for the way that you tuned into us. You reached out a helping hand, God, that you, in the form of your Son, came down from heaven and lived where we were, died on the cross for us, God, and was raised to show us that there's a new way to live, a new way of living that can produce fulfillment, that can produce fruit, that gives us purpose and passion, God. Bless our time of remembering your Son now, God, that we wouldn't just mindfully or mindlessly take the emblems, God, but that we would ruminate on the fact of your body broken for us, God, your blood spilt for our benefit, God, that you were willing to not see this existence, what you had created as an opportunity for your own self-serving, God, but that you would be willing to self-sacrifice and demonstrate the ultimate act of love on the cross. God, may we die our own deaths every day, that we would lay down our lives by the wayside so that others may experience life, God, and from that be filled to the brim by your love, God, and your purpose. We love you and we thank you for this time. We thank you for your Son. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.